August 1914. The Russian steamroller moves to crush the German Empire from the east. Two massive armies surge into East Prussia, threatening Berlin and forcing the world to believe a German collapse is imminent. But in the forests of Tannenberg, the tide is about to turn. This is not a story of Russian glory, but of broken codes and failing leadership. Outnumbered German defenders, led by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, are preparing a masterstroke of annihilation. By the end, an entire Russian army will vanish, and a proud general will take his own life. This is Tannenberg, Russia's first great disaster. The year 1914 began with a promise of quick victory. In the gilded halls of St. Petersburg, the Russian High Command believed that their sheer numbers would overwhelm any opposition. Russia was the steamroller of Europe, a massive demographic weight that could field millions of soldiers. When war was declared in July, the plan was simple. Strike East Prussia immediately to relieve pressure on France. The French were being battered by the German Schlieffen Plan in the west, and they pleaded with the Tsar to attack. Russia obliged. Despite the fact that their mobilization was far from complete, they launched two massive armies into German territory before their supply lines or communication networks were even remotely ready for a modern war. At the head of this invasion were two men who shared a deep personal hatred for one another, General Paul von Rennenkampf and General Alexander Samsonov. Legend has it that they had once come to blows on a railway platform during the Russo-Japanese War. Now, they were tasked with coordinating a pincer movement to trap the German Eighth Army. Rennenkampf led the First Army from the east, while Samsonov led the Second Army from the south. Between them lay the Masurian Lakes, a treacherous geographical barrier that naturally split their forces. This gap was the first crack in the Russian plan. Because they could not see each other and refused to communicate effectively, the two armies moved like blind giants through the Prussian landscape. The Russian soldiers were brave, but they were being led into a logistical nightmare. Many marched without adequate boots, and food supplies were erratic. More dangerously, the Russian signal corps was woefully unprepared. They lacked enough cipher books to encrypt their messages, and the few they had were often too slow to use during rapid movements. Consequently, Russian commanders began broadcasting their orders, troop positions, and daily objectives in clear plain. Unencrypted radio signals. This was a fatal error. Every word, every movement, and every moment of doubt was being intercepted by German listening posts. The Germans didn't need spies. They simply had to listen to the Russian generals arguing over the airwaves. On the other side of the border, the German Eighth Army was in a state of panic. Their commander, General Maximilian von Prittwitz, saw the two Russian armies closing in and feared total encirclement. He initially ordered a retreat toward the Vistula River, effectively abandoning East Prussia to the Tsar. This cowardice did not sit well with the German High Command in Berlin. Prittwitz was fired immediately. To replace him, the Kaiser called upon a man out of retirement, Pope von Hindenburg. He was a veteran of the 1870 war, a man who looked like a fortress in human form. To serve as his chief of staff, they sent Erich Ludendorff, the hero of the Siege of Liege. Together, they formed a partnership that would dominate German history for years to come. When Hindenburg and Ludendorff arrived at the front, they found a brilliant young staff officer named Colonel Max Hoffmann. Hoffmann had noticed something incredible in the intercepted radio messages. He realized that Rennenkampf's First Army had halted after an early victory at Kumbin. Rennenkampf was busy resupplying and, perhaps out of spite or caution, was in no hurry to help Samsonov in the south. This gave the Germans a narrow window of opportunity. Hoffmann proposed a plan that was as risky as it was genius. Leave only a thin screen of cavalry to face Rennenkampf, massive army in the east, and move almost every available German soldier south to crush Samsonov's Second Army. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If Rennenkampf decided to move even a few miles forward, he would find the German rear completely undefended and could march all the way to Berlin. But the Germans bet on the fact that the Russian generals would not help each other. They bet on the friction, the incompetence, and the sheer lack of coordination within the Russian High Command, while Samsonov's Second Army struggled through the sandy soil and thick forests of the south. Their men exhausted and hungry, the Germans were using their superior railway network to shift their entire weight toward them. Samsonov was moving into a trap, But he didn't know it. He believed the Germans were in full retreat. He pushed his men harder, demanding they march faster to catch the fleeing enemy. His soldiers were dropping from fatigue, and his supply wagons were miles behind. His communication with the First Army was non-existent. He was isolated, exposed, and blinded by his own ambition. As the sun set over the Prussian pines, the German Eighth Army was no longer running away. They were circling back, bayonets fixed, waiting for the moment to strike the killing blow. The stage was set for Tannenberg, and the Russian Second Army was walking into its grave. By the final week of August 1914, the forests and swamps of East Prussia had become a death trap. General Alexander Samsonov and his Russian Second Army were deep inside German territory. But victory was slipping through their fingers. The terrain itself was an enemy-dense woods, treacherous marshes, and sandy soil that exhausted his marching soldiers. Samsonov's men were starving. Many hadn't seen bread for days, forced to survive on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farms. Despite this, he pushed them onward, pressured by the Russian high command to maintain the advance. He was convinced the Germans were in full retreat. A fatal miscalculation. Unseen by the Russians, the German Eighth Army, now commanded by the formidable duo of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, was executing a logistical masterpiece. Using Germany's highly efficient railway network, they were shifting tens of thousands of troops from the north to the south in just a few days. It was an incredibly audacious gamble. They were essentially turning their back on General Rennenkampf's Russian First Army to the north. If Rennenkampf had advanced, he could have smashed the German flank and potentially ended the war in the east. But he didn't move. Whether due to his personal rivalry with Samsonov or a genuine fear of a German counterattack, he remained stationary, condemning his fellow commander to a slaughter. The Germans, meanwhile, had a priceless advantage. They were intercepting and reading every single one of the Russian radio messages, which were being sent. Ludendorff knew the exact location, strength, and desperate condition of every Russian unit. He knew they were low on food and utterly confused. On August 26th, the trap began to close. The German 20th Corps, which had been in a strategic retreat, suddenly dug in. To their west and east, other German corps began to swing around them like the closing blades of a giant pair of scissors. The Russian Second Army was no longer the hunter. They were being expertly herded into a deadly pocket. The fighting that erupted was savage. Near the town of Ugust, German artillery unleashed a terrifying storm of fire. The Russian soldiers, though brave, were outgunned by the superior German Krupp artillery. Their own guns were often out of range or simply lacked the shells to fire back. As German explosives tore through their ranks, panic began to spread. This was not the glorious war the Tsar had promised. It was a mechanized hell. By August 27th, the Russian flanks started to disintegrate. The First Corps on the left was thrown back in disarray, while the Sixth Corps on the right was shattered and sent into a chaotic retreat. From his headquarters in Hindenburg, General Samsonov finally began to grasp the horrifying scale of the disaster unfolding. He was losing control. The vast distances and lack of reliable communication meant his orders were obsolete before they even arrived. In a desperate attempt to regain command, he decided to move closer to the front lines to feel the battle. This move only worsened the situation. By entering the field, he cut himself off from the telegraph lines, connecting him to high command. The Russian Second Army was now a headless giant, an exhausted, surrounded mass of men. The German plan was to achieve a complete double envelopment, a tactical masterpiece not seen since Hannibal's victory at Cannae. Ludendorff was on edge, constantly fearing that Rennenkampf would finally move and strike his exposed rear. But Hindenburg remained a pillar of calm Prussian resolve. He trusted his intelligence and understood the infighting among the Russian generals. He gave the order to close the gap. The German soldiers, many of them local East Prussians, fighting to defend their own homes, advanced with a ferocity the weary Russians could no longer match. By August 28th, the noose was almost completely shut. In a tragic twist, the Russian center, made up of the veteran 13th and 15th Corps, was still pushing forward, completely oblivious that their flanks had ceased to exist. They were marching into a vacuum. When they finally realized they were surrounded, they tried to turn back, but it was too late. The roads were clogged with retreating supply wagons and panicked horses. The very forests that had offered cover now became a claustrophobic prison, with German infantry blocking all escape routes to the south. The Russians were now squeezed into a shrinking pocket of woodland and swamp. The scene inside that pocket was one of absolute horror. In the darkness of the forests, lost and terrified Russian soldiers fired on their own comrades. Men drowned in the murky swamps, trying to find an escape. The constant, rhythmic chatter of German machine guns echoed through the trees, harvesting a generation of Russian peasants. General Samsonov, witnessing the complete destruction of his army, reportedly broke down and wept. He had lost everything: his men, his reputation, his honor. In the rigid military code of 1914 Russia, there was no forgiveness for such a catastrophic failure. As the sun rose on August 29th, the German Ring of Steel was sealed. The Russian Second Army was no longer a fighting force. It was a trapped mass of humanity, awaiting either capture or death. The Germans had successfully moved an entire army, deceived 2 enemy generals, and were now tasting one of the greatest victories of the war's opening chapter. The mighty Russian Steamroller had been derailed in spectacular fashion, and the grim conclusion to the Battle of Tannenberg was now at hand. By August 29th, the Russian Second Army had ceased to function as a military organization. It had become a terrified, starving mass of men trapped in a circle of fire. The German Ring was now a physical wall of steel and lead. Every road leading south to the safety of the Russian border was held by German machine gunners and light artillery. The Russian soldiers, who had spent the last 2 weeks marching on empty stomachs through sand and swamp, were at the end of their endurance. Thousands threw down their rifles and raised their hands, their eyes hollow from shell shock and exhaustion. The scale of the surrender was something modern warfare had never seen. In some sectors, German regiments were overwhelmed not by Russian attacks, but by the sheer number of prisoners they had to process. Entire Russian divisions, once the pride of the Tsar, walked into captivity in long, silent columns. For the Germans, this was the ultimate vindication of their training and their rail system. For the Russians, it was the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty. The forest floor was littered with discarded equipment, dead horses, and the bodies of those who had tried to break out through the German lines, only to be mowed down in the undergrowth. At the center of this wreckage was General Alexander Samsonov. He was a man broken by the weight of his own failure. He had spent the last several days wandering through the woods with his remaining staff officers, attempting to evade German patrols. The shame of the disaster weighed on him like a physical burden. He had lost nearly 100,000 men. He had lost the trust of his Tsar. Most importantly, he had lost his honor. As the group stumbled through the pitch-black forest on the night of August 30th, Samsonov lagged behind his officers. He told them he could not face the shame of reporting such a defeat to the Emperor. Under the cover of the ancient Prussian pines, a single pistol shot rang out. General Samsonov had taken his own life, choosing a solitary death in the woods over the humiliation of a court-martial. His body would not be found by his own people. It would later be recovered by the Germans and buried with the respect due to a fallen commander. His death was the final, tragic exclamation point on the collapse of the Second Army. With their leader gone and their lines shattered, the remaining Russian pockets of resistance flickered out like dying candles. While the south was a graveyard, the north was a scene of frantic retreat. General Rennenkampf, upon finally realizing that Samsonov was being annihilated, did not move to help. Instead, sensing that he was now the next target, he ordered the First Army to withdraw back toward the Russian border. The German Eighth Army, fueled by the adrenaline of their victory at Tannenberg, immediately turned their attention toward him. In the subsequent Battle of the Masurian Lakes, Rennenkampf's forces were also battered and driven out of German territory. The invasion of East Prussia was over. The Russian steamroller had not only been stopped, it had been dismantled. The final tallies of the Battle of Tannenberg were staggering. The Russians lost roughly 30,000 men killed or wounded, but the truly devastating number was the prisoners. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were led away into German camps. The Germans also captured over 500 heavy guns, enough to equip several new divisions. Hermann Losses. By comparison, were a mere 12,000. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of conflict. Hindenburg, the man who had been called out of retirement, was now a national hero. The name Tannenberg was chosen specifically by the German staff to avenge a medieval defeat of the Teutonic Knights by Slavic forces centuries earlier. It was a victory of propaganda as much as it was of strategy. The consequences of this disaster rippled far beyond the battlefield. Strategically, it saved Germany from a two-front collapse in the opening month of the war. It allowed them to consolidate their power and focus on the stalemate in France. But for Russia, the wound was deep and poisoned. Tannenberg shattered the myth of Russian military power. It broke the spirit of the professional officer corps and sowed the seeds of deep resentment among the peasantry who made up the rank and file. They realized they were being led by men who did not care for their lives, by generals who feuded while their soldiers starved, and by a Tsar who was out of touch with the realities of modern industrial war. Tannenberg was the first step on the long road to the Russian Revolution. The loss of such a massive amount of equipment and trained men was a blow the Russian economy and military could never truly recover from. As the years of World War I dragged on, the memory of the missing army in the Prussian woods haunted the Russian people. The betrayal felt by the soldiers at the front would eventually boil over into the streets of St. Petersburg in 1917. In the end, Tannenberg remains a masterclass in the importance of communication and leadership. The Germans won because they were organized, because they used technology to listen to their enemy, and because they took a massive, calculated risk. The Russians lost because of arrogance, poor logistics, and a lack of unity. It was a disaster that changed the course of the 20th century, ensuring that the war would be long, bloody, and ultimately fatal for the empires of the East. The ghosts of the soldiers who fell in those dark forests still whisper a warning to history, that numbers alone do not win wars, and that the greatest enemy is often the one sitting in your own headquarters.